Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session on at-risk marine resources. We're going to go ahead and get started. So you're going to hear some talks on grouper, conch, and lobster this afternoon. So I guess this is also the delicious marine resources session. The two may be linked. Okay, so the first talk is going to be my talk, and I'm going to be telling you about acoustic telemetry revealing Nassau Grouper migratory movements during the spawning season to an unreported location. Many taxa make migrations in the air, by land, and by sea, and they do that for a variety of reasons, whether it's chasing resources, escaping predation, and also for breeding. Fish also make long-distance migrations, both in freshwater and saltwater, and often between the two. And one of the strategies that they use is to form fish spawning aggregations. These are transient gatherings of a large number of individuals for the purpose of breeding, and this often represents the entire reproductive effort for a species. The Nassau grouper is one of those species that does form these spawning aggregations, and these aggregations are very predictable in time and space. In the case of the Nassau grouper, it's generally over winter full moons throughout its range. Now, the predictability of these spawning aggregations in time and space is an advantage for a species that is normally widely distributed and when individuals live solitarily over a very large range. Unfortunately, when they congregate together, it really increases their vulnerability because it's an opportunity to maximize catch and profit while minimizing effort. So you can fish an aggregated species very quickly because they're concentrated in one place. And that is exactly what's happened with the Nassau grouper throughout its range. In the Florida Keys and the U.S. Virgin Islands, the aggregations have completely disappeared. So they have not formed for several decades. In Bermuda, same story. There was a 95% decline in the population, and it's now commercially extinct in Bermuda. Same story again in Belize and Mexico, where they've reported collapses of historically fish spawning aggregations. And then also in the Cayman Islands, where they saw extremely severe declines, so they completely shut the fishery, not just fishing during spawning aggregations, but the entire fishery. And over the last decade, and they've only now seen very slow recovery. So as a result of that, the Nassau grouper is classified as endangered by the IUCN. With over 40 reported spawning aggregations in the Bahamas, this country really has probably the majority of what's left of this species. And this is not a comprehensive map. However, the important point is that all of the locations that we know of for potential spawning aggregations come from local knowledge. The entirety of our knowledge of these aggregations is brought to the scientific community through fishermen. So that is really the foundation of where we can start to work on these things. The status of many of these aggregations is unknown, although we do know that there are collapses within the country, and some of these aggregations no longer form. But for the majority of them, we do not know the status. We don't know the spawning stock size. We don't know we don't know if they still form, and we don't know where they're coming from and going to get to these aggregations. So as a result, there's a significant knowledge gap of this ecologically and socioeconomically very important species. What we do know is that Nassau grouper movements to and from aggregations in the Bahamas are both similar and different from other areas in the Caribbean. So we know that they are tightly timed to winter full moons. But the distance that's traveled from home reefs to the aggregations is very different throughout the range. So in places like Belize, Honduras, and the Cayman Islands, they're only traveling maybe 30 to 50 kilometers between home reefs and aggregations, whereas here in the Bahamas, which is very extensive, they've been known to travel over 200 kilometers from their home reefs to their aggregation sites. We also know that throughout its range, they travel in groups along the shelf edges, along drop-offs to their aggregation sites. And then one thing that's common in other areas where the distance between the home reefs and aggregations is maybe only 30 kilometers is that individual fish will make more than one spawning migration within a season. However, in the Bahamas, because likely of the distance between where they live and where they spawn, 2 migrations within one season seems to be the exception rather than the rule. The migrations of Nassau grouper are not understood off of Andros, which is one of the largest barrier reefs in the world. And because of that drop-off into the tongue of the ocean, there is a very extensive shelf-edge habitat. There are 2 reported aggregations off Andros, one at High Cay and one at Tinker Rocks. Now, at Tinker Rocks, there is no stock or migration information at all, except that it was historically fished. For High Cay, we do have some limited information. So between 1999 and 2001, a ship-based hydroacoustic survey estimated between 9,000 and 12,000 Nassau grouper at that aggregation. However, they did not validate that in the water. But at the same time, another study did put divers in the water, and they counted only around 500 fish, which is more consistent with what fishermen were reporting at the time. But today, we don't have much recent spawning stock knowledge at all, nor do we know anything about their migrations through this entire system. So we have this black box of information. And this is really important because this is where fish spawning aggregation protection measures were first put into place in the Bahamas. In 1998, High Cay was closed to fishing over a 5-day period of spawning over the full moon for 4 straight months, November, December, January, and February. Then in 2004, there became a national seasonal closure for up to 3 months, but it was announced annually and the timing could shift a little bit. Just last year, the Fisheries Act was amended to create a permanent seasonal closure from December 1st to February 28th. Now, in the Cayman Islands, they've put some very stringent management measures into place, and they have had some very slow recovery. However, the indication so far in the Bahamas is that populations are continuing to decline. So we definitely need to know more about spawning stocks and migrations here in the country. So we aim to revisit this system where FSA management was first put into place to see what's going on. So we decided to use acoustic telemetry to describe their migrations during the winter spawning period. Our specific objectives were to revisit High Cay and check the status of the aggregation there, look at the timing of their migrations, the pathway they might be taking, and then the distances and speeds that they were taking to get to that aggregation. Based on previous studies, both in the Caribbean and in the central Bahamas, we knew that Nassau grouper most likely migrate along shelf edges, so we deployed an initial array of 13 receivers right on the drop-off in about 80 to 100 feet from Chub Cay down to Grassy Cay. We then went to High Cay in December of 2014, and the first thing we wanted to do was hop in the water and take a look where the aggregation was so we could set our pots to tag fish. So we put rotating teams of divers along the entire site from 2 days before the full moon to 1 day before the full moon, and we didn't find anything, which was alarming. However, we do know that sometimes aggregations shift a little bit, so we systematically surveyed a 2-kilometer area around from Long Cay up to High Cay, and we still did not find an aggregation, which did not bode well for the telemetry work that we were about to do. So we decided to just throw some pots in anyway, and lo and behold, we did catch adult Nassau grouper. This was great news. We caught 26 fish, of which we tagged 16. They were all adults, and then we released them back into the system to see what would happen the next month in January. When we uploaded our receivers, we got this most amazing pattern. I mean, to get data back like this with such a clear pattern was such a joy. So here, this is the telemetry data. Along the x-axis, you have date and time, and on the y-axis is the receivers in order from south to north. So the Chub Cay receiver is at the top, and then the Grassy Cay receiver is all the way down at the bottom. And you can see the fish moving before the full moon. They get to their destination at the full moon. This is the full moon right here. And you see them moving south again afterwards. So this is really great. We caught them moving to their aggregation. The only problem is the aggregation. High Cay is at this black line where receiver number 7 was. And when we went back to get the High Cay receiver, it was gone. But you can see from the other receiver data that it's very clear that High Cay was not their destination. So most of them went north. We had one guy that went south, but of the ones that went north, they reached their northernmost point the day of or the day after the full moon. And then they were back south to where they had started by 3 and 4 days after the full moon. And you can see from the migration that they were starting south of High Cay, clearly went well north of it, turned around, came back down, and then went south of it again. So they were not stopping at the High Cay aggregation site. The other thing you can tell is that they were moving in groups. So the detections of these fish that we tagged were often within minutes to each other, and they were doing that both moving north and south. So we did confirm, so again, we range tested these receivers and found that it would detect a grouper, it would detect a tag within about 200 meters. So if a grouper was detected on a receiver, then it was within 200 meters, which means since they were detected on the receivers that were in the shelf edge, they were in fact traveling along the shelf edge. The other thing we were able to look at was the speed with which they were traveling. So most of them, they traveled at about 1.7 kilometers per hour, and we were able to calculate that from sequential hits along these receivers. And then in terms of distances, pretty impressive. The northward migrators made an average one-way trip of over 100 kilometers. And then for the round-trip distances we were able to calculate, they moved from 95 to over 260 kilometers. So they're moving quite a ways. And then the southward migrator, we lost him during the full moon, but for the period of time we were able to detect him, we know that he moved at least a little over 70 kilometers within the array. So back to those original points, I'll skip the status of High Cay for a second and hit the other ones. In terms of the migration timing with respect to the full moon, we did see that they were migrating very tightly, 3 to 4 days before to 3 to 4 days after the full moon, and they were indeed traveling together in groups. And they were doing so along the shelf edge at speeds of about 1.7 kilometers, and they were moving quite far along the shelf edge. Now, as far as the status of the High Cay aggregation goes, we had originally assumed when we couldn't find it through diver observations that we simply missed it. However, based on the diver information and the telemetry data, we do think that the High Cay aggregation did not form. And instead they were going to this northern location, somewhere up near the Jolters. So what we think happened is that in December of 2014, when we threw our pots in, we happened to catch them as they were traveling in groups along the shelf edge during a northward migration. Now, without in situ confirmation of an aggregation and spawning behavior up in that northern area, it's impossible to say with certainty that that is exactly what that is. However, we do believe that that is the case for several reasons. First, we detected them only during the expected spawning period. After we released them in December, we didn't hear from them again until January. And during non-spawning periods, grouper have very small home ranges on the order of 0.02 square kilometers. So if a grouper's home range happened to overlap with a receiver, it would have been detected constantly, consistently. And we never detected a single grouper more than 16 minutes at a time. Second, they exhibited these long directed movements along the shelf edge, which is consistent with spawning migratory behavior throughout its range, including places in the central Bahamas where that has been shown. Third, their movements were very tightly coupled with the full moon, which is again consistent with spawning migrations, as is movement in groups along the shelf edge, which we saw again here. And finally, their swimming speed, that 1.7 kilometers per hour, is consistent with confirmed spawning migration work from the Exumas down into Long Island. The interesting thing, though, is that if they were migrating to a spawning aggregation in December and January, that would mean that they were migrating twice within one season, which I said earlier is the exception rather than the rule in the Bahamas. This kind of conflicts that, which shows we really have a lot to learn about what these grouper are doing, because there may be some differences even within the Bahamas. This, we care a lot, because this was the first time that Nassau Grouper movements have been described along Andros, which is one of the world's largest barrier reefs. And this is an endangered fish, and we've shown that the High Cay aggregation does not form like many other aggregations throughout the grouper's range. And we also showed that they're very vulnerable during these migrations. I mean, we caught them, and we didn't know what we were doing. So the idea of protecting migratory routes is something that is not unfamiliar, especially to, I think, the birding community, but it may be important as well here for this particular resource. And like I mentioned before, all of the aggregation locations that we know of come to the scientific community through local knowledge, through fishermen. And so this is the first time that we've added a point on the map from a different source. So that really highlights the usefulness of telemetry as a tool for studying migratory fishes. For the next steps, what we did was based on this telemetry data and conversations with local fishermen and a couple of tag returns that we had, we expanded our array to add additional receivers, especially up in that northern area, to try and increase the resolution and maybe pinpoint the location of where they might have been going to. We have not yet uploaded the receivers after this past December-January spawning period, but we're very excited to do so. We're also going to add some bathymetric mapping to that area up in the north. There are some typical topographic and features that are common among many fish spawning aggregations, so we're hoping to map out that area and see if there may be some candidate locations that we might want to check out. And of course, our ultimate goal is to get eyes in the water in the next spawning season, the 2016-2017. We'd really like to get divers up there to this location, wherever it may be, and confirm an aggregation and spawning behavior. The location of spawning aggregations very much matters. When the larvae are released, they're entrained in the currents for about 40 days until they're ready to settle into appropriate juvenile habitat. And the direction that they go is very much dependent on their starting point. So site does indeed matter. So keep that in mind. I'm teeing up the next talk for Krista Sherman, who's going to get into that a little bit more. But yes, the location of these spawning aggregations is very important. So with that, I'd like to thank my partners in crime here, Krista Sherman and Craig Dahlgren. Thanks very much to BNT for support and giving us a venue to share this information, DMR for permitting us to do this work, our financial support from various sources. Thank you very much to the many volunteers who have come out on our research cruises. Thanks very much to the Cape Eleuthera Institute and Atlantis, which have both provided people to help with this work, and also Cape Eleuthera has gone out and tried and check out some of the spots around Eleuthera as well. And with that, I will take any questions.